Hello and welcome. I'm Stuart Craner, co-founder of Thinkers50. Every year, Thinkers50 inducts new management thinkers into its Hall of Fame, which is supported by our partners at the Hire Group. The Hall of Fame recognises and celebrates thinkers who have made a significant long-term contribution to management thinking and practice. This year's inductees into the Hall of Fame are a stellar group, and it is a pleasure to recognise their contribution. My guest today is one of those inductees, Rob Goffy. Rob is best known for his work on leadership, along with his friend and colleague, Gareth Jones. They were the authors of The Character of a Corporation, Why Should Anyone Be Led by You, Clever, Leading Your Smartest and Most Creative People, and Why Should Anyone Work Here? Gareth died in 2021, so this is an opportunity to celebrate his life, and he was someone who was absolutely full of life, and the work of he and Rob in partnership. Rob, welcome and congratulations on being inducted into the Hall of Fame alongside Gareth Jones. You and Gareth were unusual in that you were friends, colleagues, and writing partners for more than 40 years. Not many duos in the management thinking world or the musical world or any other place stay together so long. So what made your relationship with Gareth work?
Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for this honour. And yes, Stuart, I think you're right. It's pretty unusual for two people to work together for so long. Gareth and I met each other in the early mid-70s as relatively young doctoral students at the University of Kent. I think the first place I met him was in a bar. And the second place may have been on the football pitch. And that's by way of saying that I think really we were friends first and foremost almost. And then we realised that our sociological interests and our doctoral research had some overlapping shared interests. And we had similar backgrounds as individuals in terms of where we'd come from and how we'd come into studying sociology. So it's a mixture of friendship and then a kind of similar early grounding in a certain kind of industrial sociology. That's what I think got us started. And over time, we just got closer and closer as friends and as working colleagues.
Because your research at the time when you met, you were both sociologists, but you were doing research into coal mining communities. It's a long way from that research to your career at London Business School and your work on leadership. How did you make the leap?
Yeah, yes and no. It is a long way. I mean, to begin with, the thing to say is that not many people would realise there's a coalfield in Kent, in the south of England, or there was. There isn't anymore. And of course, in one sense, doing research on that kind of community is a million miles away from what you end up doing in a business school. But ironically, the model I was using to look at a coal mining community involved two interesting sociological dimensions: one, sociability; the other, solidarity. And those two dimensions or kinds of social relationship became the basis of the first book that Gareth and I wrote together, The Character of a Corporation, which was a way of trying to differentiate different types of culture in business organizations and of course state organizations as well. But we were using dimensions that I had worked with in looking at a mining community.
Sociability and solidarity are still, I mean, it's a 2x2, isn't it? I mean, yeah. They actually seem more relevant now than they have done over recent decades somehow.
I like to think it has stood the test of time. So the book was published quite a long time ago. But Gareth and I regularly used it in sort of stand-up discussions with executives, and it always rang a chord with them. It doesn't sound as if it would, but it does. And, you know, sociability, bottom line, refers to sort of how friendly we are with others at work, how close we are to them, the extent to which we're willing to help people for free. And solidarity, by contrast, is the extent to which we're going to pull together in order to win quickly, whether we like each other or not. So they're independent, and it is a 2x2. But people kind of get it as a model. And as you've just implied, I think, Stuart, recent events, the pandemic, etc., I think has got us again interested in how do we hold things together in a more virtual world, and how do you build something like sociability, if you want to, in a way which is not always face-to-face, because, the classic way of building sociability, we often used to say, was little and often and face-to-face. So, the loss of that natural kind of sociability over recent years, I think, has raised all sorts of interesting questions about how you can sustain it or regain it, and at the same time build something else called solidarity, the sense of shared interests and the will to win.
What's interesting as well is that you spent your academic career at London Business School, but Gareth had jobs in the corporate world. He was HR director of the BBC, as well as academic roles at Henley Business School, IE Business School. So he brought that experience of organisational life to your work.
You're right. Gareth had a very interesting and unusual career. To mix being a professor of sociology with global director of human resources with Polygram, and then director of human resources at the BBC. That's a sort of truly unusual combination. I think that both of us were always keen to make a connection between the so-called real world of work and what you might regard as, almost classic sociological concepts. That's one of the things we were both very interested in doing and kept us together all that time. But the fact that Gareth actually had that first-hand experience was, of course, extremely useful to us. And I like to think that all the books we put together were able to sort of connect concepts with that real world of work.
And what about your experiences at London Business School? How did they inform your ideas? Because there were some great people at London Business School over the period you've been there. In the leadership sphere, we had Charles Handy was there, Samantha Ghoshal was there, who kind of more strategy, but Costas Markides and people like Nigel Nicholson and people like that. How did the experience at London Business School inform your ideas?
I certainly had good colleagues, and you just named some of them. I think working in a business school, you've got to be really interested in businesses and how they work. At the time I first joined the school, and Gareth came not long afterwards, we're talking like early, mid-1980s, and there was an obsession almost with corporate culture. I think In Search of Excellence was one of the driving forces, and I think was published from memory in very early 1980s. So there was this boom almost in, what did corporate culture, what did it look like? How could you connect it with high performance and so on? And In Search of Excellence produced a kind of interesting insight into aspects of it. And people like Samantha Ghoshal were, of course, very interested in that kind of, as a strategist, he also was very interested in issues related to organizational culture, as indeed was Costas Markides. But I think what Gareth and I were trying to do was come up with a way of describing cultures as they are, and not necessarily as you would want them to be. And that's what the 2x2 framework was that we developed. But colleagues around us, extremely. Charles Handy sadly had, I think, left almost at the moment I joined the school. But his legacy has, of course, lived on.
And after the character of a corporation, the thing that really kind of accelerated the profile of yourself and Gareth was why should anyone be led by you? And the HBR article with the same title, which won the McKinsey Award. And that led to a book with the same title. Can you tell me about the genesis of that work? Because there was a few years between the character of a corporation and why should anyone be led by you?
There was. I think what happened during that period and what led to our interest in the leadership space was that we were trying to teach leadership to executives on programs at London Business School. And we found the literature, the research, frustrating in terms of what we could actually say. I mean, historically, leadership, this is a very simple guide, as it were, to the history of it. But, it began with kind of what was known as trait theory, personality attributes, and so on, which in the end ended up rather fruitless field of research because we never could agree on the list. The list was never long enough of attributes of good leaders. Then we moved to style theory, and that produced sort of different ways of describing behaviors, leadership behaviors. And we ended up with contingency theory, which sort of said the combination of styles of behavior and personality attributes that produces great leadership varies according to context. So this great body of research ends up saying, well, good leadership, it all depends. And I have to say that's a fairly frustrating place to end and not particularly helpful in terms of trying to say useful things to executives on programs at the business school. So Gareth and I were frustrated with that. And we were also mindful, I think, that increasingly leadership had to be won. It's a relationship. You have to win people over. You aren't kind of appointed a leader. You win that sort of respect. And hence the question, why should anyone be led by you? And we felt that the whole task of leadership was getting more difficult, getting more demanding, because you had to build this relationship in times when really trust in both leaders and organizations was beginning to diminish. And in fact, it's got worse and worse in many ways over the years. So, the expectations of leadership were rising, but what we could deliver as academics in classrooms, it seemed to us, was not helpful. Too much of the research, for example, assumes that or confuses hierarchical success with leadership. In other words, the people that get to the top are leaders. And of course, we all know people, don't we, who are at the top who aren't leaders. Our base definition of leadership was the ability to excite other people to higher performance. And there's plenty of people at the top who seem to lack that, just like there's plenty of people elsewhere in the organisation who have it. So that understanding that leadership was non-hierarchical, to understand it, you had to understand it outside hierarchies. And yet so much leadership research effectively was looking at who gets to the top. And a lot of leadership research, in our view, was also excessively concerned with the individual and neglected the idea that it was a relationship. And the final thing, once you accept that leadership is contextual, it varies according to where you are, hence contingency theory. You've got to accept at that point there's no universal recipe book for great leadership. And of course, a lot of the stuff that gets published on leadership is precisely a fruitless attempt really, to establish some sort of global, universal set of leadership attributes. So you're never going to get that because it is contextual. So massive frustration at what was there, and a kind of feeling that we ought to be doing better given the demands of leadership in the contemporary period.
Yeah, why should anyone be led by you was ahead of its time, really, because the issues you were talking about, for instance, you were bemoaning the shortage of leaders. And there's one thing everybody agrees on, there's a shortage of leaders, but that's quite a long time ago. Hierarchy, similarly. But have we made progress from that time, do you think? I mean, there's hierarchy still slowing down lots of organizations and is taking as the associated with leadership.
Have we made progress? I like to think so. I think the whole idea of authenticity, once you accept that leadership, well, first of all, when trust breaks down, the issue of authenticity becomes important. Secondly, when you accept that leadership is non-hierarchical, it's not to do with position, it is to do with the person. Once it's something to do with the person, inevitably, in other words, who are you, inevitably the issue of authenticity is also raised. And I think over the last 15, 20 years, we've become much more interested in many, many times in nuanced ways in what does authenticity mean. Not always in nuanced ways. So I think some of this stuff on authenticity is slightly overworked. The little logo phrase that we used in the book was "be yourself more with skill." And we always worried when we were using that little message with people that they remembered the first two or maybe three words, "be yourself more," and forgot the last two words, "with skill." "Be yourself more with skill" is a way of saying that you must understand that you need to be yourself in ways which fit the context and build relationships with others. So once you accept that it's relational and contextual, then you must balance your authenticity, as it were, with the need to connect with other people in particular places. We sometimes used to say that, it's a bit like two cogs in a wheel. They need to connect to gain traction. And if that means you need to kind of, a phrase we used to use, you need to conform enough in order to connect. In other words, it's not all about you. And that's why leadership's so difficult. It is something to do with this balancing of authentic self-expression with the need to adapt to context and build relationships.
Yeah, be yourself more with skill. So my understanding of that is the be yourself is the authentic element. The more part of it is that you have to almost become a you have to amplify what makes you authentic, and with skill use it appropriately in the context. But for me, the amplification bit is always the most perplexed, the most challenging, I think. When to amplify and what are you amplifying?
Yeah, it's of course contextual. The answer to that question, Stuart, is it depends on the context and your read of it. And sometimes you need to, as you say, amplify it, and sometimes you need to tone it down. And that's why I get worried about some of the obsession with authenticity, because it sounds as if it's just about being yourself, and it's much more complicated than that, and it's much more nuanced. I think what we'd say, again, the way you've expressed it, Stuart, is it is like a 2x2. Be yourself more is the authentic angle, with skill is the other angle, the other dimension. This is a simplification, but I think up until the last 15 years or so, too much leadership development initiatives, they were focused on the skill element and not enough on the authenticity element. And of course, you want a bit of both. You want to be in that top right-hand corner. Be yourself more with skill. You don't want to be all skill and no self. That's the other bottom right-hand corner, as it were. And if you're all skill and no self, you'll get seen to be a player. And if you're all self and no skill, you're seen to be a kind of maverick. And actually, I used to think, and I think I may still think, that a lot of the mavericks, all self and no skill, they're not tolerated by organizations, and they know it, and a lot of them become entrepreneurs. In other words, they build their own organizations where they can effectively say to people, this is me, take it or leave it. And if you don't like it, you can go somewhere else because this is my organization. And I do think quite a lot of entrepreneurs are a bit like that. What you don't want to be is down in the bottom left-hand corner of this 2x2, no self and no skill. And that's the sort of clumsy, unaware individual that looks a bit like David Brent in The Office. And it's what makes David Brent in The Office such a sort of poignant figure, because he doesn't have either. He doesn't have sufficient self-awareness, and he thinks he has the skill, but of course he doesn't. And that's a very hard place to be. And if you're an executive in that place, Gareth and I always used to ponder, why did a program like The Office ring so many bells with people all over the world? Not just it's a UK production originally, but it rang bells with people all over the world. And it did so because it's recognized, people found it so uncomfortable to watch because they recognized it. And just think about that for a minute. If you recognize The Office, it suggests that maybe there are too many executives that are banging around in that sort of quadrant with not enough skill and not enough proper sense of self. And that's very worrying, I think.
But the leaders' role, the leaders I've met, often their self-awareness isn't that great as far as I can see, and their authenticity is always interesting because a lot of it, as a CEO or a leader in an organisation, they have to act the role in many cases. I mean, for instance, they communicate certainty when they know that the future is very, very uncertain. So there's a lot of inauthenticity is necessary to survive.
Very nicely put. And going back to our sociological interest, we used to say that leadership it's a role. It's a role. You've got to play the role, and sometimes you need to do things which you don't really want to do and you aren't necessarily comfortable with. So I think you're absolutely right, Stuart. It is a role. And, that successful performance of the role means, in our view, the phrase we used to use was, you need to know yourself enough. Now, if you follow, so it's not perfect self-knowledge, and you're right. I think we can all think of leaders who are certainly not the most introspective or possess the greatest self-insight, but they know enough. In other words, they know what works. They know what little differences they have that can help them connect with people around them. We used to, in one of our books, we used to talk about Martin Sorrell, who we said to him, "What are your differences?" And he said something like, I'm a micromanaging accountant, a boring micromanaging accountant, words to that effect. And then we asked people inside WBP at the time, what was different about Martin Sorrell. And they didn't use those words. The top of the list in terms of his differences was his remarkable speed of response to emails, which on average, speaking from personal experience, was about 5 minutes. And so here's an example of someone with attributes that you really don't think are going to work very well in an organization, marketing services organization, full of clever, creative people. That sort of accounting mindset's not going to work with them, is it? But he made it work because what he did, his obsession with the detail as an accountant, was part of the explanation for why he was someone who would respond to your email inside 5 minutes. So he was able to use this apparently unpromising set of differences in a way which worked really well, unexpectedly well, with clever, creative people. Clever, creative people go from indifference to obsession, from obsession to indifference very quickly. When they're obsessed with the latest great idea, what they want is fast feedback, and ideally from someone near the top, ideally the person at the top. And that's what, it's a kind of brilliant illustration, I think, of someone using unpromising differences, as it were, to nevertheless deliver what the people around him might want.
What's interesting about that, I remember reading it in your book, was that the accessibility was and openness wasn't abused, in that Martin Sorrell figured that nobody's going to send an email to the CEO unless it's important.
Yeah.
Because you're taking advantage and abusing the trust otherwise. Yeah,
absolutely. So in a weird and unexpected way, it worked. And I think that's what the danger, so in terms of knowing yourself, we used to say to people, understand your differences, which excite others to higher performance, and understand your weaknesses, your fallibilities, where you might need help. And I think the problematic bit here is that sometimes people read that as you need to understand your strengths and weaknesses. And without getting too complicated, differences aren't always strengths, if you see what I mean. Sometimes they are. Your superb, strategic insight could be a difference, and it is a strength. But quite a lot of the differences we were talking about were not strengths. So they shouldn't. It's not about weaknesses and strengths. It's about fallibilities and differences, as it were. And that's a more subtle kind of thing, which isn't always about what you might regard as strengths. We had an example related to Franz Humer, who at the time was running Roche, the pharmaceutical company. And, we used to ask the scientists inside Roche what was different about Franz Humer. And near the top of their list was his piercing blue eyes, and the long silences alongside his piercing blue eyes, which was his way of communicating a kind of intense intellectual curiosity. But you can't call that a kind of strength. It's just a difference which he seemed to be able to use really effectively in a way which excited others around him.
I think Franz Humer, I think you say in the book, he had early experience as a tour guide.
Yes.
And I think one of the things you pointed out was that, which always stuck with me, that a lot of the people CEOs you wrote about had early experiences in sales.
Yeah. So really, essentially, our book looks at 4 key skills: situation sensing, in terms of the relationship issue, closeness and distance, and in terms of differences and weaknesses in terms of the non-hierarchical attributes of leadership. But situation sensing, on reflection, I think what Gareth and I both felt, in other words, if leadership is contextual, you need to sense different contexts. We felt in the end that was the core, first, primary building block of leadership. And if you didn't have good situation sensing, it was very difficult to use your differences, expose appropriate weaknesses, manage social distance and so on. None of that would work properly unless you had good situation sensing. And if you don't have good situation sensing, you'll probably never make it. So the thing to stress is it's really important. Then the second thing is, well, can you get better at it? And your reference to Franz Humer's tour guide sort of experience, where, in his words, he learnt to spot who would give him tips. And a lot of people, I think, do through selling activities, get more sensitive to what works and what doesn't with other people. So situation sensing is a learnable skill. That's an optimistic thing to say. Good policemen, for example, if you have a drink with a policeman in a bar, they don't stop work, and they're normally having a look around, sensing what's going on and what should they know about around them. And you should ask yourself the question, was the policeman born with that skill? And the answer is almost certainly not. It is a developable skill. And in our view, it's the first and most profound leadership skill. And I think we can all, especially during the pandemic, by the way, and during period of crisis, you can spot, as it were, some of the people that seem to have good situation sensing and the others who did very clumsy, inappropriate things during that period. I'll leave you to fill in the dots as to who those people might be, but I think it became very visible, as it often does during a crisis, who has that ability to connect with the context and what's happening and what's important.
It always strikes me with leaders, I mean, looking around their offices, I'm always struck by how few leaders have actually got books about leadership. They might have a biography of Napoleon, but they don't seem to have. I mean, my feeling is a lot of them aren't curious about the theory and practice, the leading edge thinking about how you should lead.
I think it's probably true. I think, frankly, many of them are too busy to feel they've got time to do it. If you think about Kolb's learning style, classic stuff, that would be called reflective observation, sitting back and thinking things through. And busy executives rarely have that space or time. And quoting Kolb again, there'll be much more experience and active experimentation. And of course, that's a very rich way of learning. And it's also a hugely risky way of learning. So, you can have some massively important life experiences doing that, and can also get yourself killed. So that's why I think executives going to business schools, sometimes it's a rare moment where they're almost forced to sit back and reflect a little bit more. And that hopefully is what's going on in good classrooms, in good business schools. Whether or not that carries on with people sitting back and reading vast libraries, Stuart, I suspect that's not the case. And I do sometimes worry that, us academics, we write long books, and I'm not quite sure how much of these books actually gets properly read. And as a result of that, they get summarized and slightly misunderstood in the process.
No, to be fair, your books have become shorter, Rob.
It's a never-ending quest to make them shorter, but yeah.
Have you ever been tempted to take on a leadership role? We talked about Gareth. I mean, I know you've been Deputy Dean of London Business School. We talked about Gareth's experience in the corporate world. Were you ever tempted?
No, I think would be the simple, short answer. Gareth and I, built a little consulting business, which was something of a business that we were running. And yes, for a while, I was Deputy Dean at London Business School. And at that time, my responsibility was executive education. And executive education at London Business School is a very significant part of the overall package. So, and it's the financial performance of executive education at the school, just like it is at many other schools around the world, is extremely important. So that felt a little bit like running a business, but no. I think the closest you get to it as an academic would be long, deep dive, strategic interventions with organizational change programs. The first of which for me was with Heineken in the mid-1980s, which was going through a fairly significant organizational change process. The reason I mention Heineken is that if you've ever looked at character of a corporation, it's a very big example in the book, because it's almost the best example in my experience of a wonderful high sociability culture. Those deep, long interventions that take place over many years, you do feel a little like you're half managing things inside. And over the years, I've had that experience elsewhere with organizations like Roche and Unilever. And again, if your viewers, your listeners have read some of our works, you'll know that those organizations feature very large in our work. And Gareth and I were always, we always would have seen ourselves as qualitative researchers rather than quantitative. Our books may be too long, Stuart, but they're certainly not full of numbers, really. That we like to think that they were fairly informed by qualitative research. And, well, how do you do that? How do you do good qualitative research? And I think in the end, some of your best opportunities are with deep dive interventions over long periods of time. Nestle, by the way, another example of an organization where that happened with us. And, those deep dives are extremely, for long periods, I think can be extremely fruitful in terms of data gathering, and allow you to produce things which frankly would be quite hard by more conventional research methods.
I think Warren Bennis, the American leadership writer, I think he was dean of University of New York at Buffalo for a while, and he didn't enjoy it because he didn't feel he had much power. And I think he wrote that he was watching somebody cutting the grass at the university, and he felt the guy cutting the grass had more power than he did, and he was the dean. Which I think is probably a common problem.
Well, we wrote the book Clever on the grounds of, the people most likely to ask this terrible question, why should anyone be led by you, was the clevers. And clevers were becoming more and more numerous in knowledge-based economies, and they're likely to become ever more so. And of course, if you're an academic, you're used to working amongst and around other clever people. And our flip definition of the clevers was people who think they're smarter than you and don't want to be led. That's certainly what a lot of my academic colleagues seem like. Of course, I'm much nicer than that, but and it's a frustration. But it's a challenge for our time. Is how do you corral these high-value individuals, talented people, in ways where their efforts can produce stunning results? And of course, clevers can produce stunning results. They can also produce disasters. But the worrying thing about them is that I think one of the characteristics they often share is they'd much rather be working for themselves. They kind of act as if they are working for themselves. And, the thing they value above almost everything else is their independence, their autonomy, their freedoms. And of course, academics really don't want those things trodden upon. And then, the key challenge becomes, how you balance your kind of benevolent guardianship of these wonderful, clever, talented people, which is what you've got to do. You've got to be benevolent. You've got to look after them. But you've also got to balance that with discipline. And that's the key difficulty, I think, of the issue of leading productively clever people, how you balance this freedom and benevolent environment with some kind of discipline. Because if there's no discipline, that's how, fortunes are lost, I think.
Yeah, leading clever people. I mean, the HBR article was shortlisted for the McKinsey Prize, and actually is a really good summary of your arguments. Now, what the role of the leader is to provide the umbrella in the rain, I think was to sort of protect
these delicate flowers almost, these clever individuals from all the rubbish that goes on in organizations. And of course, there is rubbish that goes on in large bureaucratic organizations. And we felt that one of the things you could do as a leader for these people was to, be a protective umbrella for them. That article in Harvard, the subtitle, I think, was "Be a Benevolent Guardian." What I think, and that's a brilliant little subtitle, and the Harvard editors are wonderful. But what that doesn't acknowledge enough, in our view, and we hope that our subsequent book did, was how you thought about the challenge of balancing this protection and benevolence with discipline and organization and coherence. And there are different ways in which you can do it. One is the overarching vision. One is a management hierarchy, but that's not popular with clever people. The other is, the norms of the profession. They can be a way of, providing discipline to lawyers or doctors or etc. or architects. But they all have their kind of pros and cons. And of course, the problem with professional norms as a way of disciplining clever people is that they become almost independent of the organization. And then you slightly lose control in a different kind of way.
Can we talk? I remember seeing you on stage with Jack Welch, I think around the time Why Should Anyone Be Led by You? And Jack Welch actually, he was a great one for writing personal notes, wasn't he? Going back to what we were talking about earlier. But obviously his legacy has been questioned over recent years. And what's your take looking back at Jack Welch and your encounters with him, and how does he fit into your work, do you think?
I only met him once. Of course, he was married to someone who had been the editor of Harvard Business Reviews, and we knew Susie, Gareth and I, pretty well. So that gave us a kind of good in to meeting Jack. I think some of the best leaders, they communicate their humanity quickly. And so I would say on my one meeting with him and one session with Jack, he was kind of extremely approachable, friendly, and funny. And indeed wrote me a beautiful note, a day or two after we'd worked together. And the interesting thing I always feel about Jack Welch was that he, whatever his, I know some people are critical and so on, but he managed, I think, to show that you could be a very so-called hard-nosed businessman and still be passionate about people. And I think, pre-Jack Welch, people used to feel, well, if you're a hard-nosed businessman, you don't care stuff about human beings and people at work. And I think Jack Welch is a very good example of someone who was, hard-nosed in terms of demanding business standards and so on, performance. And at the same time had a real interest, I think, in people, a real and genuine interest in people at work.
And how has the pandemic affected your ideas and your thinking about leadership? Because many of the issues you've raised about hierarchy and context and situation sensing have been, seems to me, been highlighted even more over the last 3 years.
I don't think it's altered my view of what the fundamentals are of leadership. If anything, all it's done is make those fundamentals even more important than ever. I guess one of the fundamental issues has been this loss of social interaction in one way or another as a result of increase in virtual communication and so on. And I do think that raises interesting questions about place, workplaces, and leaping ahead, as it were, to the last book that Gareth and I wrote together, which was Why Should Anyone Work Here? The reason why we thought that was an interesting question, or one of the reasons really, was that we think that talented, gifted, high value, clever, creative individuals, they want to be excited by good leadership, but they also want to work in an exciting place. When we wrote Clever, I think we did some field work at Google, and one of my memories there, one of my memories was the extent to which really clever people that I met within Google said to me, well, I thought I was pretty clever. Then I came here and I discovered there are people twice as clever as I am. Wow. And I think that issue of places which feel exciting is increasingly important when you think about how you manage creative people. So that book was about what does a dream workplace, what does the ideal workplace look like? And I think the pandemic, going back to your question, Stuart, of course, has accentuated what is it we mean when we talk about workplaces, and can we combine virtual with face-to-face in creative ways, etc., etc., etc. I'm fairly old-fashioned about this, so I still think that there will always be a face-to-face thing, which is extremely important.
I'm interested, Rob. Do you still think of yourself as a sociologist?
Yes. Yes. I think Gareth and I, throughout our careers, had a kind of abiding frustration that sociology could so easily become marginalised as a serious area of academic endeavour, and yet it had so much to offer, especially the part of sociology that Gareth and I were interested in, which was known as industrial sociology, that it was a kind of really rich seam of kind of insight into sociability, solidarity, bureaucracy, capitalism. These things don't go away. The current challenges that we face in organisations do have something to do with the nature of bureaucracy. For example, pandemic, what makes a good rule? When should we follow rules and when shouldn't we? I think our last Prime Minister bumped into that question fairly big time in this country. And that's a very old issue, bureaucratic rules, the good rules as opposed to the bad rules. So we always felt there was a rich seam in the fundamental concerns of classic sociology that you could connect to modern obsessions, really, in work and in organisations. The psychologists, I don't want to sound bitter when I say this, but the psychologists, I think, have been very influential in a lot of organisational behaviour. And we always felt the sociologists had more to say. So, yeah, and we still do.
Well, I suppose that's one of the beauties of management and organisational behaviour, is the way that it has embraced psychology, sociology, and there's quite a lot of stuff now about philosophy. So management is a very magpie science, stealing ideas and insights, no matter where it might find them.
Correct. And if you go back to the leadership set of issues, then clearly, as we know from all sorts of wonderful innovations of recent years, Shakespeare, for example, can show us all sorts of insights into leadership. And I think there's space for that kind of contribution from the arts and from many different, sources, philosophy, as you just said. In fact, it's very difficult to understand authenticity as a concept without understanding existential philosophy, for example. But, we're back to the busy executive doesn't always get time to read the lengthy books.
Yeah, Jean-Paul Sartre should be required reading. So, Rob, Goffy, thank you very much. Rob and Gareth's books, just a reminder, The Character of a Corporation, Why Should Anyone Be Led by You, clever, and why should anyone work here? All required reading. So thank you very much to Rob, and also we should salute the life and work of Gareth Jones, who put sociability and solidarity to very good work. Rob, thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting me. Thank you.